Janet Flanner wrote in 1926. The world has always had lovers, and yet for thousands of years the concentrated aim of society has been to cut down on kissing. With that same amount of energy, society could have stopped war, established liberty, given everybody a free education, free bathtubs, free music, free pianos, and changed the human mind to boot. And Janet Flanner figures throughout the pages of this book. Her lover was, you would see her picture, you might later on. Her lover was a woman called Solita Solano, a writer and a theatre critic, and she was born Sarah Wilkinson. Quite a lot of these women changed their names to something more glamorous than their birth names. And my book's about creative lesbians in the decades before the Second World War, who fled the repressions and expectations of their hometowns, like Washington and London, and they formed a like-minded community in Paris. And they lived, wrote, painted, published as they chose, and were at the vanguard of modernism, that shift from 19th century orthodoxies into 20th century ways of seeing and saying. And they kissed their women lovers, and they changed the human mind to boot. And there'd been no community like this since the ancient Greek poet Sappho in the island of Lesbos. And many of these women learned Greek to read Sappho's poem verses, and they wrote their own love poems in her honor. I started writing biographies of lesbians 38 years ago. I call my oeuvre Dies Dykes, and this is the last one by me, though loads of biographies of genderqueer women remain to be written and hopefully will be written. But I've had my say and I'm bowing out. I'm 81, which is very old. Last year I went around telling strangers I'm 80 as if it was an achievement. But I'm not so keen on 81 because it sounds like being on the way to somewhere else. So I bought a country cottage and I'm stomping the lanes and feeding the birds and trying to get some sort of perspective on my own life. And I'll talk about this valedictory book and the link with previous ones I've written. There's been revived interest lately in the first lesbian biography I wrote 35 years ago about the English society painter Glark. There's been exhibitions about... Yes. There's been exhibitions about her and a TV documentary. And then I show the picture, I don't know if you know it, it was of the... it was a modernist painting by Gluck that set me on my path of lesbian biography, and she called it the You-We picture. And it was her and her lover, Nestor Obermer, and their profiles merge, and they sort of stare unflinchingly into what they think is their shared future. I first saw this painting in the Fine Arts Society Gallery in Bond Street in the early 1980s. I was working at BBC Publications in Melbourne High Street, and I'd gone into the gallery with a colleague one lunchtime to get out of the rain. I knew nothing about Gluck or Nestor Obermer, but I had a shock of recognition from that double portrait, which hopefully you'll see before the night's out. And I felt I knew what was going on in the picture. And a while after that, I got a letter out of the blue from an editor at Pandora Press saying she liked my journalism and did I have a book I wanted to write. So I thought again of Gluck and got a commission. And since then, and to this day, I've had commissions to write about what I chose. So after Gluck, I wrote about the long, happy, monogamous marriage of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, and the irony that this marriage was between two women. And then I wrote about Greta Garbo and Cecil Beaton and Garbo's lover, Mercedes de Acosta, picture, and their gender-questioning relationships with each other, and Beaton trying to capture Garbo's beauty with his photographs and her fear of losing beauty and him wanting to be her, and how elusive and shifting identity can be. And then I wrote about hypocrisy in Mrs. Keppel and her daughter. I don't know if any of this is meaning anything to you.
I've read that.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Where Alice Keppel, who was the mistress of Edward VII was lauded by society, while her daughter Violet Trefusis was forced into a nightmare marriage and exiled to Paris because she was openly in love with Vita Sackville-West. And then I wrote about the scandal of censorship in the trials of Radcliffe Hall, and how Radcliffe Hall's totally anodyne, rather dreary well of loneliness was censored and burned because its subject was lesbian love, which was deemed obscene by the grand old men of England, the lawmakers and the patriarchs. And then I wrote about the relationship between Natalie Barney and Romaine Brooks in a book first published as Wild Girls. And I interpolated semi-fictional first-person revelations so as not to distance myself from the subject. And in between, I wrote books about islands, because in my weird psyche I see a correlation between islands and being lesbian. And I wrote about other things too. And now this one, the last one, which is a sort of culmination, a synthesis, and I've been led to it by the others. Because these biographies had a gap of about 2 years between them, reviewers judged them in isolation and didn't pick up that I was repeatedly hammering away at lesbian visibility and acknowledgement of their contribution. And a breakthrough with this final book is that the publisher wanted lesbians in the title. Historically, if you hope for a mainstream publisher and for your family to speak to you again, you ducked the L word. The nearest I got previously was 20 years ago with my book about the relationship between Natalie Barney and Romaine Brooks. I submitted the manuscript with the ironic title, A Sapphic Idyll, and the marketing men said no one would know what sapphic meant. And someone came up with the title Wild Girls and a cover picture with a torso in a corset. That's girls for you. And then when the book was bought by an American publisher, I thought, good, now I'll have my sapphic idyll title. But the American marketing men said no one would know what idyll meant. So they loved Wild Girls and corsets. So from Wild Girls to Lesbians as a market plus. And for me it was a breakthrough to have lesbian in the title, on the jacket, on the spine, in the running head, to bleach the word of residual embarrassment, and to use it as an inclusive common noun and as a positive light to shine on the achievements of the women I write about. Is this making sense?
Yes, very much. Yeah.
Okay, and now of course I run into trouble on the home front. What do I mean lesbian? And terminology, nouns and pronouns are a minefield in the terrain of gender identity, with threats of cancer.
Safe in here, though.
You're totally safe
anyway,
because none of us believe in gender identity.
So I dedicate the book to LGBTQI, APD, quilt bag plus, or whatever gets you to the line. So queer or questioning, undecided, intersex, lesbian, trans, bisexual, asexual or allied, gay or genderqueer, and P for pansexual or polygamous, and K for kink.
Is that up to date though? Do you think it's possible?
No. Give me time. Plus the plus. But I couldn't have called it no modernism without quilt bag. There are only 26 letters in the alphabet, and I'm easy about using all of them for the gender diversity of women. But I didn't want to get caught up with initialism or the labelling game. So the way I use the word lesbian gets me some way to the light. But I'd like the title to suggest scorn for the endless rendering invisible of lesbian achievement. I hope the feel of this book, rather than as protest or plea for acceptance, is look at our contribution. Look how lesbians as a group created vibrant 20th century culture and rejected received ideas of concealment and shame. Paris was the setting for this cultural revolution. It took place in the first decades of the 20th century, up until the Second World War smashed everything out of its way in 1940. Paris, Gertrude Stein said, was where the 20th century was. It wasn't just what Paris gave, she said, it was all it didn't take away. In England and America, censorship of art and literature deemed offensive to pure eyes and ears meant James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence couldn't get published, and Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness was burned in the King's furnace, male homosexuality was criminalised, and lesbian expression was met with derision and insistence on silence. And in America, there was prohibition of alcohol too. So Paris was like a different planet. There was acceptance of diversity and cultural experiment. There were the boulevards and bars, good food and wine, low rent. One of the takeaway messages from this book is how crucial it is to get away to a better place if you're being diminished and demeaned. That might resonate for you a bit. I focus on 4 women from this lesbian community who are at the vanguard of modernism: Sylvia Beach, Breyer, Natalie Barney, and Gertrude Stein. 3 were American, 1 was English. Sylvia Beach, picture, started the English language bookshop Shakespeare and Company and published James Joyce's groundbreaking novel Ulysses when no commercial publisher would or could. Breyer, born Winifred Elliman, was the daughter of the richest man in England, and she became an extraordinary philanthropist and used her inheritance to finance cutting-edge writing and film and keep hard-up artists going. Natalie Barney lived her life as a modernist work of art and aspired to make Paris the Sapphic centre of the Western world. Gertrude Stein furthered the careers of modernist painters and writers and broke the mould of English prose. And I try to get to the uniqueness of each of these 4 individuals, her character, contribution, experience. But I also try to show how, as a community, when they each escaped patriarchy, family expectation, and forged their own path, they triumphed not just as individuals, but collectively. A group confidence developed, stronger than the opposition to their gender identity, and capable of facing down the tyrannies of censorship and denial. And figuring in each of these 4 lives were other creative women who loved women, their friends, their exes. A gravitational thing happened. Newcomers sought out kindred spirits, and a momentum built up, a cultural alternative. So each of them was at odds with the society they left behind. And as a group, the power base changed. There wasn't a power base, there was an evolution, a new way of being and seeing. A groundswell, much like the later gay liberation movement. But this was a separatist lesbian revolution. And I'd like to think something similar can or perhaps is happening now. The publisher came up with a subtitle. Do you want me to pause? The publisher came up with a subtitle, 4 Women Who Broke Rules, and I was all right with that. Scores of British, American and Australian lesbians gravitated to Paris between the 2 world wars. I shine the spotlight on just 4. I might have put centre stage others who came into the narrative. Janet Flanner, the composer Ethel Smythe, the novelist Juna Barnes, the writer and Hellenist Eva Palmer, the publisher Margaret Anderson, the philanthropist Winneretta Singer, loads of them and more. There was a point when I suggested the title should be Lesbians Galore in 4 volumes and counting. But just as a relationship is more than or different from those who are in it, the group becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And it was interesting for me to end up with more in this book than I put into it. I concentrated on individuals, but collectively they became more than their individual selves. I've been quizzed about my use of the term modernism, and someone asked me if I'd read the canon, and I wondered if that was another book about paedophilia in the clergy. I use the term modernism to show how singly and collectively the lesbians I write about impacted a cultural revolution. I'd written about Natalie Barnum and Gertrude Stein before, 25 and 30 years ago, and I'm pleased that my past Dykes books are still in print. This time I look at Natalie and Gertrude from a different angle and with new information. So of my chosen 4 women, Sylvia Beach opened her English language bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, in Paris in November 1919. She said the shutters were hardly off the windows before the shop filled with people. From that moment on, she wrote, for over 20 years, they never gave me time to meditate. She stocked the work of the expatriate modernist writers and poets, Ernest Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, Paul Bowles. Her shop became their meeting place, and it quickly evolved into a lending library, book club, bank, post office, and a place to meet and talk about new ideas and have tea. It's still there at Shakespeare and Company in Paris, as perhaps you know. Sylvia,
Yeah, I've seen photos of it. You can still visit it.
you can still, yes,
Yeah.
yes. And they sell this book.
Yeah.
You've got it on your Facebook page.
Well, they
There's a photo
chose it as a
them with-
book of the week or something.
Unfortunately, it doesn't recognise its lesbian past at all.
No, I know, it's a bit of a
Quite
tourist
bizarre.
thing, isn't
yeah,
it?
Yeah.
They do, but they don't.
Well, it's all
That's
the
not
man who
it.
took over from
Yes,
Sylvia Beach is
that's right.
put forward as his bookshop.
Yes,
which
well,
is
there
quite
is-
strange.
Yeah, but there's something of the feel of it, I think. But it's
Yes.
a bit of a tourist trap, I agree. Gay's the word's better. Although there should be a lesbian one. Why aren't there any lesbian bookshops in London? Anyway, Sylvia Beach, she effected introductions and she found writers places to live and found them paid work and gave advice. And she couldn't have founded her shop without guidance and support from Adrienne Monnier, whose French language bookshop was across the road in Rue L'Odéon. And then I got a picture of them together. They met toward the end of the First World War. And Sylvia went as a customer to Adrienne's shop, which was called the Maison des Amis des Livres, the House of the Friend of Books. And she was in search of a poetry magazine she wanted. She peered through the window, and Adrienne came to the door, and a gust of wind blew off Sylvia's hat, which bowled down the road. And Adrienne rushed after it and pounced on it and brushed it down and returned it. That was the beginning of much laughter and love, and of a lifetime together, Sylvia wrote. I think first encounters are interesting, for all of them really.
Yes.
Sylvia said she had 3 loves, Adrienne, Shakespeare and Company, and James Joyce. She met him in 1920 and thought him a genius. He'd been working on Ulysses, his modernist masterpiece, for 7 years, and it was condemned as obscene by the censors, and no commercial publisher would touch it. In Britain and America, magazine excerpts of it were censored. And Sylvia said the reason why every self-respecting young writer got out of America was because they couldn't get Ulysses and they couldn't get a drink. So Joyce would call at Sylvia's shop each day and sit with his head in his hands and lament the fate of Ulysses. She offered personally to publish it, and she took on more than anyone could reasonably manage. Joyce and his book consumed her life. He haunted the shop, wheedled money out of her, went into draft after draft, proof after proof, altered everything, would never declare any of it finished. Typists couldn't read his writing or make sense of any of it. One typist threatened to throw herself out of the window. Janet Flanders said no man would have given Joyce a comparable publishing service. Sylvia succeeded in publishing Ulysses, but at too high a cost to herself and Shakespeare and Company. And because it was a banned book, she had no legal protection or rights. But it is a seminal book of the whole modernist canon as it's taught in universities. It was interesting that she was the one to publish it. But when she finished doing that, because she had no legal protection, pirates and bootleggers stepped in and printed and distributed copies using her imprint and undercutting her price. And then the final insult was in the early 1930s, when censorship was revoked. James Joyce sidelined and shafted her. He sold the book to Random House, New York, and Bodley Head in London. Within months, he got $45,000, and Sylvia didn't get a bean. As for my personal feelings, well, one is not proud of them, she said, by way of understatement. This masterpiece, and she was left without anything in it. Ulysses was her only publishing venture, but she continued to stock banned books she felt were innovative. When Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness was censored and burned as obscene in 1928, she sold pirated copies, and Natalie Barney held a Radcliffe Hall salon afternoon at her home at 20 Rue Yakov. Then I could have shown you a picture of Radcliffe Hall and Una Trubridge, her partner. Breyer came to Sylvia's rescue, and with money, Breyer rescued Sylvia really with money to keep herself and Shakespeare and Company going. And Breyer's my second rule breaker and creator of modernism. She was born Winifred Elliman, and even as a child, she felt herself to be a boy needing to escape the cage of being born in a girl's body. She hated being called by her birth name, Winifred, or Dolly, a nickname her wealthy father gave her. She hated her restrictive Edwardian clothes and the pressure to wear frocks and have curls. Her parents had kept a portrait of her in their drawing room. It was of the daughter they wanted. If ever we see the pictures, I'll show you.
We've got the book actually, so you could just pass it round and women can look at the
Okay,
pictures.
or I can show you them. I can show it you here.
Yeah, but the picture's not going to be on.
Huh?
My sister is going down with computer.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's the picture of her, of the Breyer, the Winifred that her parents wanted. The word transgendered wasn't coined until 1965. For 15 years, she was an only child. And her father lived to make money, and her mother was deaf. And the atmosphere in their huge house was deadly, really. Breyer's escape was books, adventure stories, and poetry. When the son and heir was born, everything she denied was heaped on him. By rules of primogeniture, he was heir to the bulk of their father's fortune. Breyer hated him from the off. She was sent to a girls' boarding school, which compounded her gender dysphoria. She escaped home when she could, had her hair cut short, chose her name Breyer, is one of the Scilly Isles off the Cornish coast, of which she was particularly fond. And when she was 22, in 1918, she wrote a fan letter to the Imagist poet H.D. Hilda Doolittle. Breyer had learned all the poems in H.D.'s collection Sea Garden by heart and was in love with her before she met her. H.D. said Breyer loved her so madly it is terrible. No man has ever cared for me like that. And when Breyer met H.D. was in a mess. She was married to the poet Richard Aldington. She was in love with D.H. Lawrence. She was pregnant with another man's child, and she was prone to intense psychotic breakdowns. Breyer rescued her, and for the whole of H.D.'s life served and protected her. Am I making sense? Yes. They travelled to America together, and in New York they met Robert McCalman he was a penniless writer, gay, and working as an artist model for $1 a session, and he wanted to get to Paris. From one day to the next, Breyer married him. So marriage pacified her parents, secured her share of the inheritance. McCalman's part of the deal was to show up as the husband at the parents' house when required. Bra was free to live and travel with HD, help friends financially, and to fund what was new and daring in the arts. She used her inheritance to become an extraordinary philanthropist. She was sort of like a lone arts council. In Paris, she set up McCalman in a publishing house, Contact Editions, which published often for the first time the work of Gertrude Stein, Juna Barnes, Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound. She financed Sylvia Beach and her shop and hard-up artists, and she bankrolled many of the avant-garde literary magazines and the little experimental presses that, as Gertrude Stein put it, died to make verse free. But drink got the better of McCalman, and when Bra divorced him, he was known as Mr. McCallamany. In order legitimately to adopt HD's daughter, Bra then married another penniless young gay man, a filmmaker, Kenneth McPherson. With him she started a production company and made experimental films like Borderline with Paul Robeson in 1930. I think the BFI's got a print of that actually. And in 1930 she founded Close Up, the first journal in English devoted exclusively to film, and that treated film as an art form. She gave money to the burgeoning psychoanalytical movement in Berlin, and in the early 1930s she raised the alarm about fascism and anti-Semitism, and she financed the escape of Freud and more than 100 Jewish psychiatrists and intellectuals from Nazi Berlin and Vienna. In old age, Bra went back to the conundrum of being trapped in the wrong body, and she wrote unremarkable adventure stories where the hero was a young, brave boy. Natalie Barnes is my third modernist lesbian, and I include her because her outrageous sexual candour gave courage to other lesbians to be out and proud. Her lesbian lifestyle was her modernist contribution. Living is the first of all the arts, Natalie said, and living for her meant lots of lovers. Love has always been the main business of my life, she said when old. And she liked epigrams. People call it unnatural. All I can say is it's always come naturally to me, she said of being lesbian. She self-published explicit poetry about and to her lovers, and she hosted a famous or infamous Friday afternoon salon. At Miss Barnes one met lesbians, Sylvia Beach wrote, ladies with high collars and monocles, though Miss Barney herself was so feminine. If Natalie's model was Sappho's community of women as artists and lovers, her sense of drama came from her mother, Alice Pike Barney. I mean, she was a mother and a half, but she was very extravagant. Natalie graded her lovers into relationships, liaisons, and adventures. One relationship was with the portrait painter Romaine Brooks. She painted many of the Paris lesbians. She did a portrait of Gluck as well, which she called Peter, a young English girl. And the writer Truman Capote visited Romaine's Paris studio in 1943, and he called all these portraits that lined the walls the all-time ultimate gallery of famous dykes. They formed, he said, an international daisy chain. A concurrent relationship with Romaine was with the French writer Lily de Gramont, and Romaine did her portrait too. And Natalie drew up a very revisionist marriage contract with Lily. They signed it and exchanged rings and always celebrated their wedding anniversary. But problematically, this was on the same day as Romaine's birthday. In the category of Natalie's liaisons were the courtesan Liane de Pougy, Edward VII, when Prince of Wales was one of her clients, Dolly Wilde, who was Oscar's niece, and her writing talent was ruined by drink and drugs, and she killed herself in 1940, aged 44. There was the poet Renée Vivian, who died of alcohol and anorexia, aged 31. There was enough suffering in this sapphic wonderland. And as for the third category, Natalie's adventures, Alice B. Toklas, Gertrude's partner, said she picked them up in the toilets of the Paris department store. Neighbours complained about sapphic dances in Natalie's garden. My fourth modernist lesbian is Gertrude Stein. She was inseparable from her partner Alice B. Toklas. They first met Gertrude and Alice B. Toklas first met on Sunday the 8th of September 1907 in Paris. And after that they were never apart even for a day until Gertrude's death 39 years later. Gertrude said she got low in her mind if they weren't together. As I said, 30 years ago I wrote about the irony or paradox that the elusiveness of a long, happy, monogamous marriage was achieved by two eccentric women. This time I concentrate on how innovative Gertrude was in literature and art, and how fearless and experimental. She furthered the careers of Matisse, Picasso, Cézanne, Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and in her own writing she pushed at the boundaries of style and meaning. She thought what people did in bed was their own business, and her main focus was herself as a genius. 20th century literature is Gertrude Stein, she said. But she raised philosophical questions. What do you mean by what you say? Why should a book have chapters and a beginning and a middle and an end? She championed the new. She bought the paintings of Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso when they were young and unknown, before their work was valued. And in the 1920s, she mentored groundbreaking American novelists, Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. She embraced the new, and she scorned culture, she said, smelled of museums. Although in her home life she was monogamous and old-fashioned. Her fixed reference was family. Gertrude, Alice and Basket the dog. Mr. and Mrs. Stein and Baby. The Woodjams family, they were nicknamed. And she and Alice are buried in the same grave in Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. Alice's name is on the back of the tombstone. She was the wife who knew her place. And though I focus on four women, I could, as I said, have put many others centre stage. Janet Flanner, who captured the epoch in her letters from Paris. Juna Barnes, whose novel Nightwood, about her love for Thelma Wood, is a classic of modernist literature. Ethel Smythe, who was a lone woman composer. The philanthropist Winneretta Singer, who championed modern music. Margaret Anderson, who defied the censors in her journal, The Little Review. And then across the channel was Virginia Woolf, author of Orlando, which she wrote in 1928, the same year as Radcliffe Hall tried to bring out The Well of Loneliness. It was Vita Sackville-West who inspired Orlando, Virginia's biographical, autobiographical, modernist classic, where time and gender are unconstrained. I had my introduction to No Modernism Without Lesbians, "Throw over your man." That's a quote from a 1922 letter from Virginia Woolf to Vita. "Look here, Vita," she wrote, "throw over your man, and we'll go to Hampton Court and dine on the river together, and walk in the garden in the moonlight, and come home late, and have a bottle of wine, and get tipsy, and I'll tell you all the things I have in my head. They won't stir by day, only by dark on the river. Think of that. Throw over your man, I say, and come." So if there's a prescriptive message in the book, maybe it's to be found in the way these creators of modernism threw over men, or at least left them on one side, and formed a parallel society, a dynamic, artistic, lesbian community along the lines of Sappho, that Greek ideal. And the Second World War put an end to this innovative community. War came down like a shutter on all their hopes and plans. Janet Flanner said in 1939, "No one knows which side's dead men will win this war." And Virginia Woolf called war this preposterous masculine fiction, except it was and remains preposterous fact. And the debacle in Afghanistan is the latest manifestation of the preposterous folly of war. No lessons learned. And patriarchy remains intact and dysfunctional. It seems little chance of a new world order, fair, tolerant of others, kind, accepting of diversity. Hopefully, come what may, creative lesbians can find each other and individually fashion unique ways of seeing and being and contributing. So no modernism without lesbians and no better world without them either.